A Chinese mother gives birth to a baby girl a year after the massacre of pro-democracy demonstrators in Tiananmen Square. It's a happy moment, but for these parents, the future is dangerously uncertain. They've fled from the Chinese secret police because of their role in the protests. And now they're hiding from the British authorities, who want to expel them for travelling on forged documents.
We do our best to avoid going out on the street. We're frightened of being discovered by the immigration authorities. So apart from doing a bit of shopping, we stay indoors.
To escape persecution in China, Julia and William embarked on a bizarre odyssey across 3 continents. They were helped for a price by a corrupt Latin American dictator and an underground mafia of Chinese gangsters. But the people who should have helped them, the international agencies for refugee aid and Western governments, including Britain, shunned them, misled them, lied about them, and finally left them with no way out. Julia and William are being sheltered by sympathizers in Britain who are risking prosecution to help them. They had to chance discovery to go to hospital for the birth of their baby. Their problems in China started in their hometown in Canton province, where they joined the democracy movement. Julia worked there as a teacher. William designed medical equipment.
Students and teachers led the demonstrations. They went to the city hall to lodge their protest. We collected money for the students in Peking, and I painted some big posters and slogans, which spelled out the demands for democracy being made in Peking.
I was a school teacher, and I supported the Peking students. I led my own pupils out on demonstrations. I also took part in other protests too.
But all the protests came to nothing when tanks and soldiers stormed into Tiananmen Square on June the 4th, killing an estimated 1,000 unarmed protesters. China's communist leadership launched a brutal judicial revenge against all those involved. Spies and informers in every street and workplace identified those who'd spoken against the government. Soon the prisons were full and there were rumors of torture. Then came the televised show trials and the grim ritual of those about to die being reviled by their accusers before being taken out and shot in the back. It was not only those who'd been in Tiananmen Square who were at risk. Armed with secretly recorded film, police hunted down sympathizers all over the country.
Everyone was frightened. We all had to take a written test at work, an examination of what we'd been doing on June the 4th and the period before. We had to write this all down. Everyone was nervous because you had to say what other people around you, your family and colleagues, had been doing as well. Everyone was worried that we were all going to get into deep trouble for what we'd done. Some of the people involved in the demonstrations I'd helped had already been arrested, and I was frightened that I'd be next. We had only one thought, and that was to leave China as soon as possible, as quickly as possible.
Help came, indirectly and at great cost, from an unlikely source, General Manuel Antonio Noriega. The deposed Panamanian dictator not only dealt in cocaine, but also traded in refugees. Thousands of black market passports, tourist visas and phony birth certificates were sold through his consulate in Hong Kong to Chinese people fleeing to the West. Noriega earned millions, enough to fund his army payroll. Some used the phony papers to travel on to Canada and America, sometimes smuggled in car boots, only to be caught in undercover operations like this one run by US immigration officials. Last autumn, with countless other Chinese fleeing the country by any available means, William and Julia struck their deal with Noriega's agents.
A relative in Hong Kong found someone who could arrange a Panamanian visa for us. We Cantonese call these people snakeheads. They helped us, but we had to pay $4,000 for our visas and about $1,000 for our airline tickets. It took all our savings and lots of financial help from our relatives.
William and Julia's new baby has a 3-year-old sister in China she may never see. Tragically, they couldn't raise the cash for her to come with them. To escape arrest, they had to leave the child behind with friends.
We had to run as soon as possible. If we were only 1 minute slower, we might be eliminated. We both felt great pain in our hearts that we had to leave our child. Since we went abroad, I have cried every evening and cannot get to sleep. I hope one day I will see her again.
But Panama was to be no promised land for William and Julia.
We Chinese didn't feel safe or welcome in Panama at all. They really wanted all foreigners to leave, especially the Chinese. They ripped us off at every opportunity. When we landed at the airport, our passports were confiscated and we had to pay $200 to get them back. On the streets, every time we met a policeman, they stopped us and checked our papers. If you didn't have Panamanian residence papers, you had to bribe them quickly.
Chinese migrants were still pouring into Panama when the United States invaded last December. The new government declared they wouldn't honor the documents corruptly sold by Noriega's men. Suddenly, William and Julia and up to 35,000 other Chinese were deemed to be illegals with no right to live or work in Panama. William and Julia feared they would be sent back to face the labor camps in China.
Couldn't you have stayed in Panama? Did you, for example, try to get political asylum there?
We did try to stay in Panama. We approached a United Nations organization to make an asylum application, but it was not accepted. After that, we had no more options left. All we could do was to leave.
William and Julia, who by then was heavily pregnant, were forced back onto the black market. They borrowed another $10,000 from relatives and used it to buy more visas, this time for Canada, from one of the Chinese snakeheads who operate in Panama City. In early May, they set off from Panama with 31 other Chinese. But they got no further than Heathrow Airport, where they were halted by British officials who discovered their Canadian visas were forged. To avoid being sent back to China, all 33, including William and Julia, claimed political asylum. According to the United Nations Convention, if they could show they were at risk of persecution in China, they had a legal right to be granted political asylum. On the face of it, theirs was a strong case. And for the next 10 days, as they waited in a London hotel, they believed they had finally found safety. But then, on May the 11th, the Home Office summoned them back to Heathrow. Officials had decided that they were none of Britain's business. Using a technicality in the UN Convention, they ruled that it didn't matter whether they deserved political asylum or not. They had to make their application not in Britain, but back in the first safe country they'd reached after leaving China, Panama. Terrified of being sent back, the 33 went into hiding. Their case was taken up by a support group, including barrister Philip Baker.
We're upset that the initial claims for asylum were not considered by the Home Office, that very rapidly they acted to remove this group out of this country back to Panama and offered no adequate safeguards, no adequate legal safeguards for the group.
So what fear did the Home Office have about granting political asylum to these 33?
I think it's a floodgate fear. They had the fear that if they treated this 33 in any way other than as unwanted baggage, that others, perhaps as many as 3,000, would come from Panama to this country.
Alistair Darling, Labour's frontbench spokesman on immigration, was also angered by the Home Office's treatment of the 33.
Well, the government, along with everybody else, was genuinely shocked at what we saw on the television just over a year ago. The problem is that, having been shocked, they are not prepared to accept the consequences, and that is there will be people fleeing from China because they fear for their lives. And it is completely dishonest to express great concern and horror 12 months ago, and now to say, but we want nothing more to do with you should you arrive on our doorsteps.
If the British government insisted on sending us back, it would be like sending us back to our death. I've spent 6 months in Panama and I never felt safe. There was robbery and muggings everywhere. When we were in Panama, I didn't set foot outside my door. I just sat in my room crying every day. If I had to spend more time like that, I'd go mad, so I'd rather die here. I won't go back to Panama.
In law, they could be sent to Panama only if it was a safe country for them. The Home Office told the support group there was no danger for Chinese in Panama. Panama would allow the 33 to re-enter. They could claim asylum without hindrance. The support group for the 33 decided to see whether the Home Office had got their facts right. They nominated 2 Chinese-speaking women, Lau Bing-sum and Harriet Evans, to go and find out. World in Action went with them. The 2 researchers working for the Chinese refugees in London have arrived in Panama City. Here they have to investigate 2 things. First, whether it's true that Chinese people here live in fear of harassment, bribe-taking and physical attack. And second, and most important, whether they have reason to fear that they might be deported from here to China and persecution. There's no shortage of illegals in Panama's Chinatown. They live in overcrowded apartment blocks and have no legal right to work. The 2 researchers listened to the stories of 12 of them who were too scared of Panamanian reprisal to show their faces.
I mean, one guy described himself as being like a mouse and the police as being the cat. And when he sees a cat coming, he flees, he scuttles away because he's scared that they will pick him up for bribes. I mean, that's a very, very common daily occurrence, it seems, because they're illegal.
And are they talking about violence against them on the street at all?
Yeah, I don't know what you can...
Yeah, certainly. There's mugging, particularly directed towards the Chinese. When they see Chinese, they see money, you know, and they're placid. They are quite willing to give them some money just to get rid of the trouble.
2 days later, Bing found out for herself just how hostile Panamanians could be to Chinese.
We were in a taxi. Myself and 3 Chinese friends were driving along this avenue in my back. There was a traffic jam, so the cars were moving very slowly forward. And one man came towards our car and hit me really hard, tried to hit me very hard with his shirt. And luckily, the window was half closed, so I wasn't hurt, but it was so forceful that it was really frightening.
Why do you think he did that?
I don't really know, but my friends told me this kind of anti-Chinese actions is very often, almost every day.
But he did it just because you were Chinese, he did it?
Well, they told me that's the reason.
The overriding impression I got was that they feel very strongly that their basic human rights have been violated in as much as because they're illegal, they're not allowed to work. In other words, they've got no means of making a livelihood.
Poor Panamanians complain that those illegals who do find jobs are ready to work for such cheap rates that they create another problem, as a leader of the local Chinese association explained.
Now we have a problem of unemployment, and these Chinese people mostly compete with the local laborers and the same type of job because they are not very skilled laborers, and they are taking jobs away for the Panamanians, and the Panamanians are not happy about that.
What do you think would happen if the British government put these 33 Chinese people in England on an aeroplane back to Panama City tomorrow? What would happen?
The government would have a tremendous problem on hand to try to deal with this, and the only way they could get out of the problem would probably say, all right, we're going to send you back to China.
And for the London researchers, that was the big question. If the British authorities were wrong in saying there was no danger for Chinese in Panama, could they also be wrong about the most important point, that Panama would protect the refugees from persecution in China by granting them political asylum? Bing and Harriet went to the immigration department to test the system.
Well, I asked for information about applying for political asylum. The woman on the desk appeared not to know what this was, so she turned around to 2 policemen behind her. They sent me round here, to this room here, to a Senora Yasmada. So I asked her what I had to do to apply for political asylum. She gave me the phone number of the Ministry of Government and Justice.
So, Harriet, what are the ministry telling you?
Well, they're not really being much use. The woman at the end of the phone started giggling.
Why?
Well, she asked what I wanted, and I said that I was phoning up on behalf of a friend who needs to arrange their put their papers in order.
Yes.
And she said, well, what papers? And I just said papers. And she said, well, what? And I said, well, it's about political asylum. She said, wait a minute, and then she turned back and talked to her friends.
Yes.
And just started giggling, and I had to hang on for a few minutes. She then gave me 2 numbers of ONPAR, so I've got 2 more numbers to call.
But the ministry itself, she couldn't offer you any advice or assistance?
No, what she did say was that she advised me to go to Migración.
Which was where you've just been?
Right.
So you're going round in circles already?
Yes.
Chinese leaders were just as confused about Panama's asylum system. Had they ever heard of a Chinese political refugee getting asylum in Panama? Spokesman Ed Yin.
No, I haven't heard any such cases.
Not one single case?
Not one single case.
In search of more evidence, Harriet Evans went to the local newspaper office.
There's a build-up of articles about illegals. For example, on February the 17th, there's the announcement of a policy of voluntary repatriation of all those without legal papers here. On March the 16th, there was a report of the deportation of 100 illegals here, and presumably included amongst those are Chinese. Then on March the 16th, the head of immigration said that illegals should come forward to present themselves as candidates for the program of voluntary repatriation. If they wanted an extension of stay, they could apply for further 30 days. Otherwise, they would have to leave within 5 days.
Panama's immigration department was run until May by Jose Chen Barilla.
Apart from the voluntary repatriation program, did you consider the policy of deporting the Chinese who were here illegally?
It costs a lot of money to send people back to China, and we do not have that money. But if the people get a visa or get authorization to go to another country, we will be very happy to let them go.
But so far as you were concerned, you would like to send them to China. The only problem was the cost.
That's right.
Now, this group of Chinese people in London originally came into Panama on tourist visas. Could they have applied for political asylum here?
No, they cannot apply for a refugee or for a political asylum because they apply for tourist visa either in Hong Kong or another country, and they arrive to Panama as a tourist. Therefore, from the Panamanian policy is that they cannot apply as a political refugee because they came to Panama as a tourist.
And that's it, there's no question about that?
Then there is no question about it.
If the British government now send the group of Chinese people back to Panama, what would happen to them then?
We will send them back to England.
Getting refugee status in Panama starts here, in a crumbling building in a side street. It's the public office of a joint United Nations Panamanian government body called the Eligibility Commission, which grants refugee status to people like these. It's run by this woman, Olympia Diaz. The fairness and competence of this organisation is central to the British Home Office's argument over the 33 Chinese in London. In May, the Home Office wrote they were satisfied Panama had a fair determination process in place for handling refugees. This wasn't true. Mrs. Diaz told us the Commission hadn't sat since autumn because of the invasion. What's more, the United Nations told Whitehall this 2 months earlier. The Home Office also maintains none of the 33 tried to get asylum in Panama. At first, Mrs. Diaz seemed to confirm this.
Since the Tiananmen Square massacre on June the 4th last year, have you seen a single Chinese asylum seeker or refugee status seeker? Not one.
Ninguno.
This was puzzling because in London, William had told us that he'd tried to apply for asylum to a United Nations organisation in Panama without success. That night, Harriet rang William in London. He confirmed he'd been to Mrs. Diaz's office 4 times. To prove it, he then rang a relative in Canada and had them fax a letter to Harriet in Panama bearing the stamp of Mrs. Diaz's organisation. If William was telling the truth, why wasn't he helped by the very organisation the British Home Office now says will hear his case? Next morning, we went back to Mrs. Diaz to find out.
Do you remember yesterday we were talking to you about Chinese refugees? And you told us that you had never seen a Chinese refugee come here looking for refugee status.
That is true.
But overnight, we spoke to a particular Chinese man who says that he did come here in January of this year. And that he saw you, Olympia Diaz. This is you? And is this the stamp of your organization here? Mrs. Diaz looked uncomfortable and then made her first concession. She had indeed met William, but he'd not asked her for political refugee status.
They asked for help to obtain a visa to go to Canada.
Do you remember him coming in?
I understand that some Chinese man came in here asking for some sort of help.
This Chinese man says he came here 4 times and he saw Mrs. Diaz personally, that he asked for political refugee status and she told him to go to his relatives in Canada, that she would not let him become a political refugee status. Then Mrs. Diaz made a second admission. Not only had William been to see her, they'd opened a large file on him and Julia. An assistant was ordered to bring it in, but Mrs. Diaz still claimed that William had only ever wanted to go to Canada. But she's saying she does now remember him coming.
With all respect, this Chinese gentleman is lying.
She's not just guessing about what he said. She actually does remember him being here.
I have already said that I had one very brief interview with him.
Can she explain why he came to this office if he wasn't seeking political refugee status? This is not, after all, a travel agency.
If you had the time, I would give you an idea of the number of people who come in here asking for all different kinds of help that isn't within our mandate.
Can she explain why she took photocopies of his passport and his wife's passport if he wasn't asking for political refugee status, if all he was asking was to leave the country?
That's done with all the people who are interviewed here and who make an application for our files.
Does she acknowledge, as it says in this letter, that he was talking about his history of political persecution in China?
Yes.
What she's saying is that despite all that, for some reason, this man failed to ask for political refugee status, even though he was in the office whose job it is to give out that status.
He was asked. He said no, and that he wanted to leave.
Do you understand why that man would leave this office and then go to gangsters and pay huge amounts of money to get out of this country if you'd offered him any help? No. By now, the 2 researchers had a clear idea of what might happen to the 33 Chinese in London if they were forcibly returned to Panama. Even if they got through immigration, they wouldn't get political asylum. They couldn't get residency permits. They couldn't work legally and might suffer racial attacks and harassment by corrupt officials. But would they be returned to China against their wills? Something the 33 fear, but the British Home Office says wouldn't happen. Panama's present immigration director, who still displays a collection of phony passports confiscated from Chinese illegals, has a different view. Is it part of the policy to try to persuade the mainland Chinese to go home?
It's not to persuade. It's to send back. It is not to persuade because they are illegal in this country. And as they are here illegally, we have the law on our side. And they will be sent back through the same route that brought them here.
In London, the 33 Chinese are living like fugitives, afraid of showing their faces in a country they thought would help them. Their lives are in limbo, like millions of other refugees now shuttling round the world, who are finding Western governments increasingly indifferent to their plight. The Home Office refused to be interviewed for this programme. However, David Burgess, the solicitor acting for the 33, plans to use the material gathered in Panama to challenge their ruling.
They have daily, if not hourly, risk of being caught. Can't even contact their families to tell them that at least they're alive. These people were victims in China, they were victims in Panama, and now they are victims here. They feel that they are forever fleeing persecution. It is a dreadful situation for them.